In Ukraine has created a global energy crisis that has led countries across the world to reopen coal plants, restart nuclear reactors, and boost oil production in order to fix a short-term crunch. Meanwhile, the consequences of climate change are getting worse and worse. Is there a way to provide people the energy they need today and at the same time tackle the issue of climate change? I'm joined by the CEO of Chevron, Mike Wirth. Mike Wirth, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Fareed.
So when you look at the price of oil now, around $83, $84 a barrel, it is where it was before Russia invaded Ukraine. And most people said the war is going to cause severe constraints on supply. Once China reopens, they were consuming 2 million barrels a day that they stopped during COVID. So how come it's still at $83 a barrel?
The fear was, and prices ran up on the concern that Russian supplies would come out of the market. That hasn't happened. Russian crude still is flowing to different places, but it's still in the market. And in fact, the policy of both the US and the EU has been to keep those supplies flowing to try to impact the price at which that oil trades. So I think the fact that prices are largely the same as they were before is because supply and demand is largely the same as it was before the war. There are risks that China demand can increase. We'll see how the concerns about a recession in the US play out. But I think the risks are on the demand side in the two biggest economies.
So I want to ask you the question that people look at with despair. If you go back to 1980 and you look at world energy use, world energy use was 90% fossil fuels, roughly. If you look at it today, 40 years later, it's about 80%. A lot of people would say you're the problem, that the fossil fuel industry has gotten all kinds of subsidies, has had laws written, has been given all kinds of benefits, has mounted a campaign of misinformation. So I want to give you an opportunity to tell me, why do you think it's been so difficult to wean us off fossil fuels when we do know that they are causing climate change?
Well, the first thing is, Fareed, demand has increased since 2000. I'll just go back 20 years, not 40 years. Demand for oil and gas has increased by 1/3 in the world in just the last 20 years, despite the concerns about climate, despite a tremendous investment in wind and solar and tremendous growth in renewable power.
And why do you think that is?
Population is growing. There's a middle class today that continues to grow, and everything that a middle class lifestyle requires is dependent upon energy: light, heat, mobility, space heating, space cooling, mechanized agriculture. The things that the emerging economies rely on for a better standard of living all require energy as an input.
Most of this increase in demand has come from the emerging markets, the developing world.
Fastest growing sources of demand are in the emerging markets, and the demand is met by the energy sources that work best in these different countries. And there is no one solution. There are many different solutions that these countries are seeking.
So you say you believe that climate change is real, you want to do something about it, you said you don't know anyone who disagrees with what the Biden people are doing on the Inflation Reduction Act. What would you do to try to stop, you look at the trend lines and they look really bad. What would you do?
I would encourage, there are three things as you talk about the energy transition that really matter: scale, speed, and solutions. So scale the energy system is enormous, to keep the lights on, to keep the trains running. And the consumers of energy tend to be long cycle capital investments: airplanes, ships, factories. Cars, electric vehicles are about the fastest turnover part of the energy consuming system, and they last for 20 years. So the scale is enormous and growing every day.
Just to put that into English so people understand, if you're building an airline, it's going to go run for 40 years. You need to know the fuel that you use is going to be around for 40 years.
And if you're buying a plane today, you don't retire it 2 years from now because you decide you want to run it on a different fuel. It's got their business requires them to fly that airplane for decades to amortize the investment in the plane. When you get to speed, The introduction of technologies is governed by economics and demand. And we've seen when coal came into the system to go from 1% of demand to 10% took 60 years. And it was a much smaller energy system in those days. Both oil and gas took 4 decades to go from 1% to 10%. We've seen $4.5 trillion invested in wind and solar over just the last decade. And it's moved from 1% of global energy supply to 3%. So the scale governs the speed. The speed will be different in different parts of the world. And so that brings me to the third point, which is we need all solutions. We need wind, we need solar, we need electric vehicles. We also need oil and gas. We should be trying to find a way to make every component affordable, make it reliable for national security purposes, and make it ever cleaner.
And what do you say to, somebody like an Al Gore who will say, the problem is we're still too reliant on fossil fuels. The only way to start to break that kind of dependency is to force these oil companies to produce less, either by taxing them or by regulating them. That part of the problem is we have an easy addiction to your product, and we need to end that.
To force the existing energy system out of use right now is going to take economies backward. It's going to take the quality of life backward. It will move society in a direction that society doesn't want to go. And so what we've got to do is find ways to move forward, to encourage all these technologies to compete on a lower carbon basis, but to exclude the 80% of what runs the world economy today and say that no, you can't use that is that's not what progress looks like. Everybody wants, I'll call it energy system A, which is the one we have today, 80% fossil fuels, the same as it was decades ago. It wants to switch to system B, but system B is 1 or 2% built. And if we turn system A off, we're getting an example of what that could look like by watching Europe right now and some of the concerns, the prices and the worries about energy security. We need to seek an orderly transition, which means stability in pricing, stability in supplies. We can't create economic chaos and pain on individuals, or they will lose interest in an energy transition if the cost is too high.
30 years from now, will that number, with 80%, 80% of energy use worldwide is fossil fuel. 30 years from now, what will that number be?
It may be lower than 80, but it will still be a substantial portion of the mix.
Mike Wirth, pleasure to have you on.
Great, good to be with you.
Next on GPS, where did coronavirus come from? The debate came back to the fore this week, but my next guest says we are asking the wrong question. I'll explore when we come back.